Hey guys, Caleb here with DSLR Video Shooter, and today we're doing a huge camera showdown between the Sony A6300 and the Panasonic GH4. These days, the number one question I get asked isn't which lens should I buy, it's should I get the Sony A6300 or should I go for the Panasonic GH4? So today I want to settle that. So what we're going to do is talk about a couple different categories and go over the big differences, the big winners in each category. And the reason I'm doing this is there's a lot of little things that actually make a big difference when it comes to using these cameras for video. So I want to make sure you guys are aware of those little things before you make your decision. The second thing I want you to note is that this is all going to be video specific. I'm not talking about shooting stills on these cameras. If I had to choose between these two for stills, I'd probably pick the A6300 due to the sensor size. But we're talking about video, so it's going to be a little different when it comes to shooting video versus shooting stills. And then finally, a big factor for me when it comes to choosing the right camera is which camera do I reach for when it actually comes down to shooting. One other note before we get started, if you're wondering what the heck all this stuff is on my GH4, I recently put up a video talking about the GH4 mods that I just completed. So I talk about how I built all this stuff and all that goodness, so check that out. So without further ado, let's start with talking about some of the physical differences that make a big difference when shooting video. To do that, let's head over to the bench and get this party started. All right, let's talk about some physical differences between the GH4 and the A6300. Obviously, a big one is size. The A6300 is significantly smaller, but it doesn't really bother me. Record button's really awkward. You can't use the shutter, which you can use on the GH4, but those are small things, right? Otherwise, you know, they're both going to be somewhat decent. If you just don't want to use any cages or anything attached, the GH4 has a much nicer feel and grip, which is awesome. The back screen on the A6300 is horrible. The screen quality is okay, it's not great, but mainly the articulation or lack of articulating screen really sucks. So all you can do is adjust the one axis. So it's nice because you can see the screen when it's low or a little bit when you have the camera up high, but that's it. Most of the time I keep this out for overheating purposes. It's strong feeling, but nothing beats a good old school articulating screen that you can do anything. You can flip it around, see your image from the front. A lot of the time I'm finding myself doing something like this, where I have it on the side, which is really handy and just straight up impossible on the A6300. I also like how on the GH4, if I know I'm going to be storing the camera, I can close it off and nothing's going to mess with my screen, which is really nice. The GH4 screen itself is much better than the screen on the A6300, so that's something to consider. It's a lot sharper. I never use anything. I rarely jump in to check focus because the screen is so dang sharp. It actually starts to alias the screen, not your actual footage. But you can always see if you're in focus or not, which is a really, really slick feature and due to the awesome screen on the back of the camera. So that's kind of a big deal. Another thing that just bugs the heck out of me is the placement of the SD card on the A6300. It's right next to the battery underneath the camera. Most of the time you have to take the camera off of a tripod to access that because you have to have the door swing all the way out. And even then, to insert and remove the card, it's ridiculously difficult. So I don't know if that, I'm sure it's an engineering thing. They had no more room because it's such a small body, but I really wish they had done something like this where you have an easy access to the camera card. You don't have to take it off of the tripod. So that is definitely a big difference between these two cameras. Another big difference is power. So we've got these dinky little batteries that come with the camera, and I'm not really going to dock it a huge amount just because this camera is so small, so you know you can't put a big battery in here. But if battery life is important to you, the GH4 has incredible, legendary, if I do say so, battery life, and I've been able to shoot all day most of the time with one battery or two if it's, you know, a lot of shooting 4K continuously. Another big one obviously is jacks or ports. So on the A6300, you have microphone, USB, and HDMI. That's it. So not a lot of I/O. On the GH4, we've got a headphone jack, yay, because the A63 does not have that. We've got a mic input, we've got HDMI, and the digital AV out. I do like that the A6300 has a USB port, which is really slick, and I don't know why more cameras or manufacturers do that. It's really nice to be able to update it just by plugging it into your computer instead of doing the whole SD card formatting funky business. You can also charge the battery that is in the camera via the USB, so that's kind of cool. But, you know, not as many options as the GH4. Another thing I want to talk about is the EVFs on these cameras. Both are really good. So unlike screens, which there's a big difference, the GH4 is much better. Both of these EVFs are pretty darn good. The GH4, I'm a little more partial to. The cup is much better on the GH4, but again, that's due to size. And finally, I want to talk about something I call the rigless score. And simply put, it is a way to score cameras based on whether or not they need accessories. Unfortunately, the A6300 scores really low. You need some way to monitor audio, which means bringing in either a monitor, or you're also going to need some way to power this camera externally if you want any kind of decent record time. And a cage is really nice because it's such a tiny camera. There's not a lot of mounting options. The GH4, on the other hand, is ready to rock out of the box. You have great battery life that's going to last you a long time. You have a headphone jack, so you don't need any audio accessories. The preamps are decent on this camera, and the image is really good. So you really don't need anything with the Panasonic GH4. So if you're thinking about, well, this camera might be a hair cheaper, especially compared to the new GH5 that's probably coming out, you have to think about all that other stuff you're going to have to get to make this camera usable. Now let's talk about the image of these two cameras and a couple differences. The big one is going to be the sensor size. So the A6300 has a much larger sensor, around an APS-C size sensor, compared to the GH4, which is rocking a micro four thirds sensor. So significantly smaller than the A6300. Now I know a lot of people are going to mention you can get a speed booster and that will help, but it's not the same as having a larger sensor. Another big factor between these two is the image quality when it comes to 4K. Between the two, I didn't notice a big difference. You're going to get great images out of either of them, so that's really not a deciding factor. That said, the A6300 does use a 6K sensor downscaling to 4K, so you might notice a little more detail or sharpness on the A6300, but unless you look really closely, it's not a massive difference. Low light is a big one, and the clear winner here is the A6300. So if you shoot a ton of low light stuff, this shouldn't be a question. You should not get the GH4. The speed booster will help, faster glass will help, but even with this camera set to the lowest ISO setting, there is noise in the blacks and in the shadows on this camera. So that's something to consider when you're thinking about video. At 4K, the noise is less noticeable, and I'm sure you guys are gonna talk about it now, but up to this point, I've never really had people say, you know what, this video looks really noisy, and I don't really care for it. So when it comes to the final published video, I don't think noise is as much a factor, unless you're gonna try to shoot this at 3200 ISO in the dark, which is going to look really bad. And now we come down to slow motion. The Sony A6300 has up to 120 frames per second at 1080. The GH4 goes only up to 96. Couple differences though. The GH4 conforms in camera. So if you shoot at 96 frames per second and you want your final video to have 24 frames per second, you're gonna have a slow motion 24 frames per second file ready to go. It's already slow motion. You can watch it on the back of the camera. On the Sony A6300, it just shoots at that frame rate and you have to do the conforming in post. So in my opinion, it's kind of a wash. This one has a slightly better frame rate, but this camera has the in-camera conforming. So something to consider if slow motion means a lot to you. Another big thing with the image is rolling shutter. Clear winner here is the GH4. After years of shooting on this, I've really never experienced rolling shutter. So the A6300 is really bad. So if you're gonna do any kind of intense movement, even somewhat quick camera movement like this, you're gonna get in trouble. That's where this camera really falls apart. One of the reasons it isn't necessarily the greatest choice. But if you're just going to shoot interviews and casual B-roll, you're not shooting sports or shooting handheld while on the back of an ATV in the jungle, if you're not doing those things, you'll be fine with this camera. One huge one, obviously, the one everyone talks about, is overheating. This is just not going to happen on the GH4, but the A6300 really does a bad job here. As it stands, even with the new firmware, it's almost impossible to shoot outdoors with the A6300 if you're going to be in sunlight. That said, indoors, I've had respectable record times of over an hour without any issues at all. So if you're going to be doing standard kind of interview setups, you shouldn't have an issue here. Now I want to talk a little bit about lens options. The good news is both of these cameras are some of the most flexible mounts and sensors in the world, dare I say, of cameras. And that means that you can really get almost anything on these two cameras, which is awesome. So if you're really into adapting lenses, either of these is going to be a great choice in that department. It's really going to come down to whether or not you're okay with a crop sensor or a heavy crop like the GH4's Micro Four Thirds, or if you want something a little larger. While we're talking about lenses, we need to talk about autofocus, which on the A6300 is incredibly good. The GH4 really falls apart here. So if autofocus is a big deal, the A6300, it really is incredible here. Now let's talk about a couple miscellaneous features, some of the stuff that isn't necessarily high on the list, but is still very important. The first is record time. This is where things kind of get interesting. The A6300 can record for 30 minutes and then it stops recording and you have to manually start it again. The GH4 will record until the camera card is full, but it'll break it down into smaller, I think 4 GB file sizes. So you'll have a bunch of different file sizes that you'll have to string back together in post. For the most part, those file sizes are seamless. So if you record for 2 hours on here, you're going to have roughly 2 hours. Every once in a while, it might be mainly card speed. I have noticed that there's a frame missing between the two files. So if I record for 20 minutes and there's 3 files, I might be missing 1 frame between those 3 files. So if you're doing very mission critical stuff when it comes to time code, maybe not a great option. Obviously, if you use an external recorder, all of this is irrelevant, but that's something to consider. This camera, 30 minutes, but then it's going to stop. This camera's going to keep rolling, but it's going to break it into smaller file sizes. So that's something to consider when it comes to runtime. Time for the big brass tacks question. Which camera is best, quote unquote? I'm not going to say which is best. I'm going to tell you which one I would use for which situation. And then I'm going to tell you which one I would pick if I had a gun to my head and I could only keep one of these cameras. So when it comes to shooting, if I'm shooting B-roll or anything that I'm going to have to do a lot of focus work, I instantly reach for the A6300. I love that I can turn continuous autofocus on, grab this camera, even with the cheap kit lens, which I actually really like, and shoot some incredible stuff just by moving the camera around. But if I ever have to deal with audio and these two cameras are sitting on my desk, I almost always reach for the GH4. Often I want to pick up the A6300, but then I gotta add a monitor to get a headphone jack or something like that, or add a recorder, and I just decide to pick up the GH4. If audio is important, GH4 is really great, and it is a great all-around camera, even though it has some, disabilities when compared to this camera. But if you're just going to be shooting B-roll imagery and you're just going to do the occasional interview or audio recording with your video, the A6300 is a great option as well. So now for the big question, which camera would I choose if I had to pick one? And unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, I would go with the GH4. I would miss dearly and I would weep over not having the amazing autofocus and low light of this camera, but just knowing that I have a solid workhorse that's not going to fail me is important to me. So I hope that's kind of helped you guys navigate this question of which camera is going to be best for you. Let me know in the comments below if you still have questions, and I'd be happy to help you out there. If you want to see more videos like this, gear reviews, tutorials, DIY filmmaking videos, please subscribe here to DSLR Video Shooter and give me a like below. That'll let me know that you enjoyed this video and want to see more like it. So thank you so much for watching. I will see you guys in the next video.